The emergency pod's metal hull groaned as it settled deeper into the crystalline sand of Kepler 442b. Inside, Captain Sarah Chen's body lay motionless, her breathing barely visible through the cracked visor of her emergency suit. The life support systems had failed 3 hours ago, but somehow she still lived, suspended in a state that defied every medical protocol known to human science. 50 meters away, behind a cluster of violet-hued rocks that jutted from the alien landscape like broken teeth, 6 pairs of eyes watched the strange vessel. The cubs were no larger than Earth house cats, but their intelligence burned bright in those amber orbs. Their fur shimmered between deep purple and silver, changing color with their emotions and the angle of the twin suns overhead. The eldest of the cubs, barely past his first molting season, crept closer to the pod. His name was Zik, though humans would never be able to pronounce the series of clicks and whistles that formed it. His littermates followed, their small paws making no sound on the strange surface that covered this part of their world. The metal thing had fallen from the sky during their morning hunt, trailing fire and smoke like an angry sky beast. Their mother had warned them about such things before she disappeared during the last cold season. "The Starwalkers bring change," she had whispered in their shared mind-speak. "Some changes heal, some destroy. You must learn to tell the difference." Zik pressed his small nose against the transparent section of the pod. The creature inside looked unlike anything in their world. It had no fur, no scales, no natural protection against the elements. Its skin was pale, almost the color of the morning mist, and it wore artificial coverings that seemed to serve the same purpose as their natural coats. But there was something else, something that made Zik's whiskers twitch with recognition. The creature was dying. He could sense it in the way all young hunters learn to sense wounded prey. But this was different. This dying had a wrongness to it, like a song cut off before its final note. The creature's life force flickered like a flame in strong wind, but it refused to be extinguished. Zik's sister Nira joined him at the pod's surface. Her fur had shifted to a worried blue-gray, the color their kind showed when faced with a puzzle they couldn't solve. She placed her paw next to her brother's, and together they felt the vibrations coming from inside the strange vessel. "It breathes wrong," she spoke in their silent language, her thoughts touching Zik's mind like whispered words. "The rhythm is off, like it fights against waking." The other cubs gathered around them now. There was Kess, whose fur bore the rare golden streaks that marked him as a future leader. Myra and Tira, the twins who never strayed far from each other's side. And little Pip, barely past his first season, whose curiosity often led them all into trouble. Pip was the first to notice the readings on the pod's external display. The symbols meant nothing to them, but the colors spoke a universal language. Red meant danger. Yellow meant caution. And the pulsing green light that flickered weakly near the creature's head meant life, but barely. "We should tell the elders," Kess suggested, his golden fur rippling with uncertainty. "The elders are 3 days' journey," Zik replied. "This Starwalker doesn't have 3 days." They had all heard the stories passed down through generations of their people. Stories of the time before, when their world was different. When their ancestors had been simple creatures, no more intelligent than the rock hoppers that still inhabited the lower valleys. Then the Starwalkers had come, different Starwalkers from this one, and everything had changed. The change had not been kind to many. Whole species had vanished in the great poisoning that followed. But for Zik's people, the change had brought gifts, intelligence, longer life, the ability to speak mind to mind. The Starwalkers had called it an accident their ancestors had learned later, a biological weapon that had mutated, become something else entirely. But the memories also carried warnings. Not all Starwalkers were the same. Some brought death, others brought wonder, and a rare few brought both, unable to control which would win. Zik studied the creature in the pod more carefully. Its breathing had grown more shallow, but the wrongness he sensed wasn't coming from its body. It was coming from its mind. Something held it back from full consciousness, like an invisible chain wrapped around its thoughts. "I think," he said slowly, sharing his thoughts with the others, "this one doesn't want to wake up." The cubs looked at each other with the solemn understanding that came naturally to creatures who had learned to survive in a world where danger could appear from any direction. They had all lost parents to the harsh realities of their world. They understood the desire to sleep when waking brought only pain. But they also understood something else. Sometimes, those who didn't want to wake were the ones who most needed to be awakened. Nira placed her paw against the pod again, this time spreading her claws to make contact with the metal surface. Through the vibrations, she could feel the steady rhythm of the creature's heart. It was strong, much stronger than its breathing suggested. This Star Walker was fighting something, but not death. It was fighting consciousness itself. Mother used to say, Pip spoke up in his small, mental voice, that sometimes the bravest thing is to face another day. The others turned to look at their youngest member. Pip had been barely old enough to remember their mother's lessons when she disappeared, but he had always been the one to remember her exact words. She also said, he continued, his first shifting to the deep green of memory, that some gifts can only be given by those who have nothing left to lose. Zik felt a chill that had nothing to do with the alien wind. He understood what Pip was suggesting. Their people had abilities that most creatures in the galaxy did not. They could touch minds, share thoughts, and under certain circumstances, they could do much more. But using those abilities on a Star Walker was forbidden. The Elders had made that law long ago, after the first contact had gone so wrong. Too many of their kind had been lost trying to help creatures whose minds were too different, too alien to safely approach. Yet this Star Walker was dying, and not from any wound they could see. It was dying from a refusal to live, and that was something Zik's people understood all too well. If we do this, he said carefully, we do it together. No one enters that mind alone. The cubs formed a circle around the pod, their small bodies pressed close together. This was how their kind shared strength, pooled their mental resources to accomplish tasks that no individual could manage. It was something usually done only by adults, under the guidance of elders. But these cubs had been forced to grow up fast. Their world didn't allow for long childhoods, and they had learned to rely on each other in ways that would have amazed their ancestors. Zik was the first to extend his consciousness toward the pod. His mind brushed against the edges of the Star Walker's thoughts and immediately recoiled. The alien mind was like a vast storm, full of images and emotions that made no sense to him. But underneath the chaos, he sensed something familiar. Grief, loss, the kind of deep, aching sorrow that came from surviving when others hadn't. One by one, the other cubs joined their strength to his. 6 young minds, linking together in ways that their species had perfected over countless generations. Together, they reached out toward the dying Star Walker, not to intrude or control, but simply to offer what they had learned about survival. They showed her their memories, the taste of morning dew on crystal flowers, the warmth of sunlight through the canopy of their forest homes, the simple joy of running fast enough to outrace the wind, the comfort of knowing that others understood your pain without needing to speak of it. And slowly, very slowly, they felt something shift in the alien mind. The storm began to calm, and beneath it, they sensed something unexpected. Recognition. The Star Walker's memories began to surface, and through them, the cubs saw wonders beyond their imagining. Great vessels that sailed between stars, cities that floated in space, creatures of every possible shape and size living together in harmony. But they also saw loss, a ship falling into darkness, friends trapped behind walls of twisted metal, a choice made in desperate seconds that saved everyone except the one making it. The Star Walker named Sarah had stayed behind to manually activate her ship's escape pods. She had watched her crew fly to safety while the ship's reactor went critical around her. She should have died in that explosion. Instead, she had awakened in an emergency pod with no memory of how she had gotten there. The medical systems told her that her crew was safe, that the automated distress beacon had been activated, that rescue was coming. But rescue meant returning to a life where she would have to explain why she survived when protocol demanded someone had to stay behind. It meant facing the families of those she had saved, seeing in their eyes the gratitude that felt like an accusation. It meant living with the knowledge that she had been ready to die, had accepted death as the price of her choices, only to be denied even that final act of purpose. So she slept. The pod's medical systems could keep her alive indefinitely, and in sleep, she didn't have to face a universe that seemed determined to deny her the peace she sought. The cubs felt her pain like an echo of their own losses. They understood the weight of survival, the guilt that came with outliving others, but they also understood something she had forgotten. The point of surviving wasn't to honor the dead by refusing to live. It was to carry their memory forward, to make sure their sacrifice had meaning. Through their shared mental link, they began to show her what they had learned, how to transform grief into strength, how to find purpose in protecting others who were vulnerable, how to wake up each day not because it was easy, but because someone, somewhere, needed you to. In the pod, Sarah's breathing began to deepen. Her eyes moved beneath closed lids as her mind processed the strange, gentle touches of the alien consciousness surrounding her. For the first time in days, her body began to respond to the medical systems trying to heal her. But waking up was still a choice she had to make for herself. The cubs settled in around the pod as the twin suns began to set. They had done what they could. Now they would wait and watch and hope that their gift of understanding would be enough to call this lost Starwalker back to life. In the growing darkness, the pod systems hummed quietly, and somewhere in the depths of her healing sleep, Sarah Chen began to dream not of endings, but of beginnings. Sarah's eyes opened to the sight of 6 small creatures pressed against her emergency pod. For a moment, panic tried to take hold. Her training screamed warnings about unknown alien species, contamination protocols, and first contact procedures. But something in their amber eyes stopped her fear before it could fully form. They weren't threatening her, they were protecting her. The realization came with a flood of memories that weren't quite her own. Images of running through crystalline forests, of sharing warmth during cold nights, of standing together against dangers too large for any one small creature to face alone. The memories felt real, but they were tinged with an alien perspective that made her understand she wasn't remembering her own experiences. She was remembering theirs. Sarah's hand moved to the pod's internal controls, muscle memory guiding her through the wake-up sequence. The medical scanners came alive, flooding her visual display with data that should have been impossible. According to the readings, she had been unconscious for 6 days. Her body showed signs of accelerated healing that defied explanation. Injuries that should have taken weeks to recover from had mended in less than a week. More importantly, her psychological readings showed something that made her pause. The crushing depression that had held her in artificial sleep was still there, but it was no longer alone. Threads of something else wove through her mental state. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of hope. Outside the pod, the cubs had arranged themselves in what she somehow understood was a protective formation. Zik, whose name she knew without knowing how, positioned himself where he could see the approaches from 3 directions. The others spread out in a pattern that would let them warn of danger from any angle. They had been watching over her, guarding her while she healed. Sarah activated the pod's external communication system. She had no idea if these creatures could understand human speech, but she had to try. "Hello," she said softly. "My name is Sarah, thank you for protecting me." The cub's ears perked up at the sound of her voice, but their response came in a way she hadn't expected. Instead of sounds, she felt their reply directly in her mind. Not words exactly, but concepts and emotions that translated into understanding. "Relief curiosity, welcome safe now." The sensation was overwhelming and wonderful at the same time. Sarah had read theoretical papers about telepathic species, but experiencing it firsthand was unlike anything she could have imagined. It was like hearing music made of thoughts. "Starwalker wake, good feared lost to forever sleep." This came from Zik, she realized. Somehow she could distinguish between their mental voices, each one carrying its own unique flavor of personality. "You were afraid I wouldn't wake up," she said aloud, testing whether they could understand her spoken words as well as project their own thoughts. "Yes, correct, mind locked in grief cage, hard to break free." This was from Nira, whose thoughts carried an undertone of gentle wisdom that seemed older than her apparent age. Sarah began the process of opening the pod, moving carefully to show she meant no threat. The cubs backed away slightly, giving her space but remaining close enough to respond if she collapsed. When she finally stood on the alien soil, Sarah felt the full weight of what these small creatures had done. They had not just watched over her body. They had reached into her mind, found the chains of guilt and despair that held her trapped, and offered her a way to break free. But they had done more than that. They had shown her how. Through the mental link that still whispered at the edges of her consciousness, Sarah began to understand the cubs' history. They were orphans like her, not in the literal sense, but in the way that mattered. They had lost their adult guides and protectors and had been forced to learn survival on their own. But instead of letting that loss destroy them, they had become something stronger. A family built not on blood, but on choice. They had learned to protect each other, to share their strength, to find meaning in making sure none of them faced the darkness alone. You understand now. Pip's thoughts touched hers, carrying the innocent hope that only the young could maintain in the face of terrible truths. I'm beginning to, Sarah replied. She looked around at the landscape surrounding them. Kepler 442b was beautiful in an alien way, but it was also clearly dangerous. The crystalline formations that dotted the area showed signs of recent seismic activity. The twin suns were setting, and she could already feel the temperature beginning to drop. These cubs shouldn't be out here alone. They were too small, too young to survive in such a harsh environment without adult protection. But they were doing it anyway, and they were doing it while protecting her. "Where are your adults?" she asked, directing the thought toward all of them. The response came layered with old pain, but also with the acceptance that comes from grieving something thoroughly. "Gone lost to the burning time we survived together now." Sarah felt her heart clench. The burning time seemed to refer to some kind of disaster that had claimed their parents. These cubs had been surviving on their own, probably for months, maybe longer. No wonder they understood her grief so well. They lived with their own every day. "How long have you been alone?" she asked. "2 cold seasons, many warm days since last adult. 2 of whatever passed for winter on this world." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. These weren't just random alien creatures who had happened to find her pod. They were children, essentially, who had learned to survive by protecting each other. And now they had extended that protection to her. The night was coming fast, and with it came sounds that made the cubs' ears flatten against their heads. Predators, Sarah realized. Things that hunted in the darkness and would see a small group like theirs as easy prey. "Must move to safe place, night hunters come soon." Zick's mental voice carried the authority of someone who had learned leadership through necessity, rather than choice. Sarah looked at her emergency pod. It contained supplies that could help them all survive, but it was too heavy to move quickly. And from what she could sense through her growing connection to the cub's thoughts, speed was essential. "Can you show me where to go?" she asked. The response was immediate. 6 small bodies began moving in formation, with Zick taking point and the others spread out to cover their flanks. Sarah grabbed what she could carry from the pod and followed. The cubs moved with the practiced efficiency of a military unit, but there was something more than training in their coordination. They were linked, she realized, not just emotionally, but mentally. They shared information instantaneously, reacted to threats before they became visible, and adjusted their formation based on data that came from all their senses combined. It was like watching a single organism with 6 bodies. Sarah had been trained in squad tactics, had led teams through hostile environments across a dozen worlds, but she had never seen coordination like this. The cubs moved like water flowing around obstacles, always maintaining contact with each other, always aware of every member's position and status. And somehow they had included her in that awareness. She could feel their mental touches guiding her steps, warning her of unstable ground, steering her around patches of vegetation that carried the psychic signature of danger. Without conscious thought, she began to move in harmony with them, her human coordination integrating with their alien grace. They traveled for nearly an hour before reaching their destination. It was a cave system carved into the base of a crystalline cliff, hidden behind a waterfall that caught the last rays of the setting suns and threw rainbows across the stone. The cubs had made this place their home, Sarah realized as she followed them inside. The cave had been modified, expanded in places where the natural formation wasn't quite right for their needs. Small alcoves had been carved out for sleeping. A central area had been smoothed to create a gathering space, and everywhere there were signs of the artifacts they had collected during their time alone. Pieces of technology from various crashed vessels. Crystal formations that seemed to have been chosen for their beauty rather than their utility. Even what looked like primitive artwork, scratched into the cave walls with careful attention to detail. They had built more than a shelter, they had built a home. Safe here protected, warm night hunters cannot enter. Neera's thoughts carried pride and satisfaction. This was their achievement, their creation. They had taken an empty cave and transformed it into something that could nurture life. Sarah set down her supplies and looked around with new understanding. These cubs hadn't just survived their losses. They had thrived. They had created something beautiful and safe and meaningful, despite having every reason to give up. They had done what she had thought was impossible. They had transformed their grief into purpose. As the night settled around them and the sounds of hunting predators echoed from the darkness outside, Sarah found herself sitting in the cubs gathering space, surrounded by 6 small creatures who had somehow become her teachers as much as she might become theirs. Tomorrow we show you more teach you, or ways if you want to learn. Kessa's thoughts carried the formal courtesy that seemed to be their way of extending invitations. I would like that very much, Sarah said aloud. But even as she spoke, her mind was working through larger implications. These cubs were alone, but they shouldn't be. Somewhere on this world there had to be adult survivors of their species. And if there weren't, if these 6 truly were the last of their kind, then they needed more than just survival. They needed a future. Sarah had been a ship's captain before the disaster that brought her here. She understood leadership, planning, and the kinds of long-term thinking that survival sometimes required. But more than that, she understood something the cubs didn't yet. She wasn't the only human who would eventually come looking for her. Her pod's distress beacon was still active. Rescue ships would find this world, and when they did, they would find these cubs. The question was what would happen then. Would her people see the cubs as she was beginning to see them, as individuals worthy of protection and respect? Or would they see them as specimens to be studied, resources to be exploited, or obstacles to be removed? Sarah had been ready to give up on her own life just days ago. But as she looked around at the home these orphaned children had built, at the family they had created from nothing but determination and love, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She felt like she had a reason to fight again. Not just for her own survival, but for theirs. These cubs had saved her life in ways they probably didn't even understand. Now she was going to make sure they had the chance to live the full lives they deserved. Outside, the night hunters called to each other in voices that spoke of claws and hunger. But inside the cave, surrounded by warmth and the gentle touch of alien minds that understood her better than her own species ever had, Sarah began to plan for a future that suddenly seemed worth fighting for. 3 weeks passed before Sarah understood the true extent of what the cubs had given her. It wasn't just mental healing, though that alone would have been remarkable. They had somehow accelerated her physical recovery in ways that defied human medical science. Her broken ribs had knitted perfectly. The internal bleeding that should have killed her had stopped and healed without scarring. Even the radiation exposure from her ship's failing reactor had somehow been neutralized, leaving no trace in her system. But it was only when she witnessed the cubs using their abilities to heal an injured climbing beast that she began to understand how they had saved her. The creature had fallen from the crystalline cliffs above their cave, landing hard enough to shatter its wing membrane and snap one of its legs. By all rights, it should have died within hours. Instead, the cubs surrounded it in the same formation they had used around her pod, their minds linking to create something larger than the sum of their individual abilities. Sarah watched in amazement as the creature's injuries began to close. Not instantly, not like magic, but with the accelerated precision of a body that suddenly knew exactly how to repair itself. The cubs weren't healing the creature directly. They were teaching its cells how to heal more efficiently, guiding its natural processes toward perfect recovery. Life wants to continue, we just show it how. Zick's explanation came with the tired satisfaction of someone who had done this many times before. This was how they had survived, Sarah realized. Not just by protecting each other from external threats, but by healing each other when protection wasn't enough. It also explained why they had been so eager to help her. Healing others wasn't just something they could do. It was part of who they were, as fundamental to their nature as breathing was to humans. But there was a cost. After healing the climbing beast, the cubs were exhausted in ways that went beyond simple tiredness. They moved slowly, their normally bright fur dulled to muted shades, and their mental communications became whispers rather than the clear thoughts she had grown accustomed to. Big healing takes much strength, need rest now. Pip's thoughts carried the weakness of extreme fatigue, but also the deep satisfaction that came from saving a life. Sarah spent the next day caring for them as they had cared for her. She brought them water from the clear stream that fed the waterfall outside their cave. She used her emergency rations to supplement the food they had gathered, though she was careful to test everything first to make sure human food wouldn't harm them. Most importantly, she stood guard while they recovered, using the training that had made her a starship captain to watch for threats they were too weak to detect. It was during this vigil that she finally understood what her role in their little family was meant to be. The Cubs were healers and telepaths, gifted with abilities that could work miracles. But they were still children, and their world was full of dangers that required different kinds of strength to face. They needed someone who could think strategically, who understood technology, and who could plan for threats that hadn't yet appeared. They needed a protector who could guard them while they used their gifts to help others. The realization came with a sense of purpose that Sarah hadn't felt since before the disaster that stranded her here. She had been a captain without a ship, a leader without anyone to lead. But these Cubs didn't need her to be their commander. They needed her to be their guardian. When they had recovered enough to communicate clearly again, Sarah shared her understanding with them. "I want to stay," she said aloud, while also projecting the thought as clearly as she could. "Not just until rescue comes. I want to be part of your family." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Six minds touched hers with such joy and relief that she nearly wept. But underneath the happiness, she sensed something else: fear. "You are Starwalker, your people will come, will take you away." Nira's thoughts carried the weight of old knowledge, memories passed down from elders who had experienced first contact before. "Not if I don't want to go," Sarah replied. But even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't that simple. Humans had legal obligations, chain-of-command protocols, and bureaucratic systems that didn't recognize the right to simply disappear into an alien wilderness. When rescue came, there would be questions, medical examinations, debriefings that could last for months. And once the official reports were filed, there would be scientific expeditions to study the Cubs and their abilities, military assessments of potential threats, corporate interests looking for resources to exploit. The Cubs' home would become a research station, their peaceful existence shattered by the well-intentioned but destructive curiosity of human civilization. Unless Sarah could find a way to prevent it. That night, while the Cubs slept in their alcoves, Sarah sat by the cave entrance and activated her emergency pod's long-range communications array. It had taken weeks to jury-rig a connection that could reach beyond the planet's atmosphere, but she finally had access to the Galactic communication network. Her first priority was checking on her crew. The automated reports confirmed what the Cubs had helped her remember. Everyone had survived. Her sacrifice had saved them all, and they were currently recovering at Kepler Station, the nearest human outpost. Her second priority was research. If she was going to protect the Cubs from the consequences of human contact, she needed to understand the legal and political landscape she would be dealing with. What she found was both encouraging and terrifying. The Galactic Accords had established strict protocols for dealing with newly discovered sapient species. Any species demonstrating intelligence above a certain threshold was automatically granted protection from exploitation, with their worlds designated as restricted zones until formal diplomatic relations could be established. But the same accords also required extensive study and documentation before such protections could be granted. And the definition of sapient was frustratingly narrow, based on human standards of intelligence and civilization. The Cubs were clearly intelligent, but would human officials recognize their telepathic abilities as signs of advanced cognition? Would their healing gifts be seen as evidence of sophisticated biological knowledge, or dismissed as instinctive animal behavior? Sarah spent hours reviewing case studies of other first-contact situations. The results were mixed. Species that built obvious cities and used recognizable technology were usually granted protection quickly. But species like the Cubs, who worked with natural systems rather than against them, often faced years of debate before their rights were recognized. Years during which they could be studied, relocated, or worse. Sarah closed the communication link and sat in the darkness, thinking. The Cubs had saved her life and given her purpose again. She owed them more than her survival. She owed them their freedom. But protecting them would require more than just staying with them. It would require changing how humanity saw them, and that meant taking risks that could destroy everything she was trying to preserve. When morning came, Sarah found the Cubs gathered in their central space, their mental link humming with conversation she couldn't quite follow. They had been discussing her late-night communications, she realized. They might not understand human technology, but their telepathic abilities let them sense the emotional weight of her discoveries. "You are worried about your people coming here." Zik's thoughts carried the calm acceptance of someone who had learned to face unpleasant realities without flinching. "Yes," Sarah said, "I'm worried about what they might do to you." "Will they hurt us?" This came from Pip, whose young mind couldn't quite grasp the concept of harm coming from those who were supposed to be helpers. "Not intentionally," Sarah replied carefully. "But they might separate us. They might try to take you away from here to study you and understand how your abilities work." The cubs exchanged rapid mental communications, their thoughts moving too fast for Sarah to follow. When they reached some kind of consensus, Zik spoke for all of them. "Then we must make sure they understand we are people, not things to be studied." The simplicity of the statement hid its profound implications. The cubs weren't planning to hide from human contact. They were planning to meet it head-on, to prove their worth as individuals rather than specimens. "That's dangerous," Sarah warned. "If they don't accept you as people, if they see you as animals or resources, there might not be a chance to convince them otherwise." "All life is dangerous, hiding is also dangerous, better to choose our danger." Neera's thoughts carried the wisdom of someone who had learned that safety was often an illusion, and that the choice of which risks to take was sometimes the only freedom left. Sarah felt a surge of pride and terror in equal measure. These cubs had more courage than most of the adults she had served with during her military career. They were willing to risk everything to maintain their freedom and their family bonds. But they were still children, and the forces they would be facing were beyond their understanding. "If we're going to do this," Sarah said slowly, "we need to do it right. We need to show them not just that you're intelligent, but that you're people with rights and cultures and families worth protecting." "You will help us do this?" Kess's question carried hope and trust in equal measure. "Yes," Sarah replied, "but it means I need to prepare you for what's coming, and it means we need to create a record that will prove who you are no matter what happens." Over the following days, Sarah began the most important mission of her career. Using her pod's recording equipment and her own knowledge of human bureaucratic systems, she started documenting everything about the cubs' lives, their abilities, and their culture. She recorded their healing sessions, their telepathic communications, and their sophisticated problem-solving abilities. She documented their artistic creations, their social structure, and their complex emotional lives. Most importantly, she recorded their relationships with each other and their obvious capacity for love, grief, joy, and hope. The cubs participated eagerly, understanding that these records would be their voice when human officials arrived. They demonstrated their abilities, shared their stories, and opened their minds to Sarah in ways that showed levels of trust and sophistication that no mere animal could achieve. But as the documentation grew, so did Sarah's awareness of the approaching crisis. Her pod's distress beacon was still active, and sooner or later rescue ships would arrive. When they did, the fate of 6 orphaned cubs would rest on whether humanity could recognize them as the remarkable people they truly were. And Sarah would have to trust that the evidence she was gathering would be enough to protect the family that had saved her life. The rescue ships arrived on a morning when the twin suns painted the crystal landscape in shades of gold and amber. Sarah felt them before she saw them, their fusion drives creating vibrations that the cubs' sensitive telepathy detected long before human sensors would have registered their approach. "Sky metal coming, many minds aboard, some curious, some afraid." Zik's mental voice carried the strain of trying to process thoughts from beings he had never encountered before. Human minds, Sarah realized, must feel as alien to the cubs as theirs had initially felt to her. "3 ships," Sarah said aloud, watching the distant specks grow larger against the alien sky. "1 medical frigate, 1 science vessel, and 1 military escort. Standard first contact protocol." The cubs gathered around her, their fur rippling through colors she had learned to recognize as nervous excitement. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but no amount of practice could fully ready them for their first encounter with humanity. Sarah activated her emergency pod's communication array and sent the message she had prepared. "This is Captain Sarah Chen. I am alive and well, but I need to speak with the ranking officer before any personnel make planetfall. This is a formal first contact situation, and protocols must be observed." The response came within minutes. crackling with the tension of people who had been expecting a simple rescue operation and were suddenly dealing with something far more complex. Captain Chen, this is Admiral Martinez aboard the UES Wellington. We're reading your life signs as stable, but we need immediate medical confirmation of your status. Prepare for emergency extraction. Negative, Admiral, Sarah replied firmly. I repeat, this is a first contact situation. The indigenous population of this world includes sapient beings who have provided me with aid and protection. Any landing must be conducted according to Galactic Accord protocols. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Sarah to worry that her message hadn't been received. When Admiral Martinez spoke again, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trying to process unexpected information. Captain, are you saying you've made contact with intelligent alien life? Affirmative. I'm transmitting comprehensive documentation now. You'll want your xenobiology team and your diplomatic corps to review it before making any decisions. Sarah triggered the data upload she had prepared, sending hours of recorded interactions, detailed analysis of the Cubs' abilities, and formal testimony about their intelligence and cultural sophistication. The package included everything from recordings of complex problem-solving sessions to artistic works the Cubs had created. Most importantly, it included her formal recommendation that the Cubs be granted immediate protection under the Sapient Species Protection Act. While the rescue fleet processed her data, Sarah turned to the Cubs, who had been following the conversation through their telepathic connection with her thoughts. This is it, she told them. Everything we've prepared for comes down to the next few hours. We understand you have given us voice in their minds, now we must speak for ourselves. Neera's response carried the calm determination of someone who had learned to face life-changing moments with grace. The Cubs had insisted on being part of the first contact process, despite Sarah's concerns about their safety. They understood better than she did that hiding would only confirm human suspicions that they were non-sapient creatures to be protected rather than people to be respected. 2 hours passed before the next communication came from the fleet. When it did, Sarah could hear the excitement and uncertainty in Admiral Martinez's voice. Captain Chen, our xenobiology team is calling your documentation extraordinary, but we need direct confirmation. Would your hosts be willing to participate in a formal first contact meeting? Sarah looked at the Cubs, who had been monitoring her thoughts throughout the conversation. Tell them yes, but with conditions. We meet in our place. They come as guests, not conquerors. Zik's thoughts carried the authority of someone who understood the importance of establishing equal standing from the first moment. They're willing to meet, Sarah replied, but it will be on their territory according to their customs. A small delegation only. No weapons, no recording equipment beyond what's necessary for translation, and no attempts to take samples or measurements without explicit permission. Understood, we'll prepare a diplomatic team. Sarah spent the remaining time before the human delegation arrived making final preparations. She had done everything she could to document the Cubs' intelligence and culture, but she knew that human officials would make their own judgments based on direct observation. The Cubs, meanwhile, prepared in their own way. They spent the morning in what Sarah had learned to recognize as a form of meditation, linking their minds more completely than usual and sharing strength for the ordeal ahead. Together we are stronger than apart. We'll see unity, not just individuals. Pip's thoughts carried a wisdom that still amazed Sarah. The youngest of the Cubs often understood things about their species that the others missed. When the human shuttle finally landed near the waterfall that concealed their cave, Sarah felt her heart racing with the same nervous energy she had experienced before her first command mission years ago. Everything she had worked for came down to this moment. The delegation that emerged from the shuttle was exactly what she had expected. Admiral Martinez, tall and commanding in his formal uniform. Dr. Elizabeth Cray, the fleet's leading xenobiologist, carrying recording equipment and scanning devices. Commander Torres from the Diplomatic Corps, whose job it would be to assess the Cubs' potential for formal relations with humanity. And Captain James Reed, her former first officer, whose presence told her that this was about more than just first contact. They were here to evaluate her decision to remain with the Cubs, to determine whether she was acting rationally or had been somehow compromised. Sarah met them at the entrance to the Cubs' domain, positioned so that she could serve as both translator and protector if the meeting went wrong. "Admiral," she said formally, "welcome to Kepler 442b. I'd like to introduce you to the people who saved my life." The cubs appeared from behind the crystalline formations that surrounded their cave, moving in the coordinated formation that Sarah had learned was their way of showing respect for important occasions. Their fur had shifted to formal patterns of deep blue and silver, colors that Sarah had learned indicated ceremonial significance. Dr. Cray's scanning equipment immediately began registering readings that made her eyes widen with amazement. "The electromagnetic patterns," she whispered. "They're not just communicating telepathically, they're creating a shared cognitive field." The cubs approached the humans with careful dignity, stopping at a distance that felt formal but not threatening. Zik, as their unofficial leader, stepped slightly forward and spoke in the way Sarah had taught them would be most impressive to human officials. The cubs' words came as thoughts projected with enough force that even non-telepathic humans could sense them as whispers at the edge of consciousness. But more than that, the thoughts came accompanied by images and emotions that conveyed meaning more clearly than any spoken language could. "We greet you, Starwalkers of Sarah's people. You are welcome in our domain. We offer water, food, safe rest as courtesy demands." The formal hospitality greeting was followed by a mental image of the cave system, showing clearly that this was an invitation into their home rather than a surrender to human authority. Admiral Martinez's expression shifted from skepticism to amazement as he processed what had just occurred. "They're not just intelligent," he said quietly. "They're diplomatic." Commander Torres stepped forward, her diplomatic training helping her recognize the formal nature of what was happening. "We accept your hospitality with gratitude," she said aloud, hoping that Sarah would translate. But translation wasn't necessary. The cubs had been practicing, and Nira responded with thoughts that came accompanied by emotional undertones that conveyed meaning across species barriers. "Your courtesy honors us. Come see what we have built. Understand we are people like you." What followed was the most remarkable first contact session in human history. The cubs led the delegation through their home, demonstrating not just their intelligence but their culture. They showed the humans their artwork, their sleeping areas, their food preparation spaces, and their healing chambers. More importantly, they demonstrated their relationships with each other and their sophisticated understanding of social structures, cooperation, and shared responsibility. Dr. Cray's equipment registered readings that defied everything humanity thought it knew about telepathic species. The cubs weren't just sharing thoughts. They were creating collective intelligence, pooling their mental resources to solve problems that no individual could handle alone. "The implications," she whispered to Admiral Martinez, "are staggering. They've evolved a form of consciousness that's inherently collaborative. Their individual minds are like instruments in an orchestra, creating something larger when they work together." But it was when the cubs demonstrated their healing abilities on a small, injured creature they had been caring for that the humans truly understood what they were witnessing. The precision, the knowledge of biological systems, the careful attention to the creature's comfort during the process, all spoke of medical understanding that rivaled humanity's best efforts. "We heal because life is precious, all life connected, hurting one hurts all." Pip's explanation came with an emotional depth that left several of the humans visibly moved. This wasn't just advanced medical technology. It was a philosophical understanding of the interconnectedness of all living things. Commander Torres found herself struggling with emotions she hadn't expected. These weren't just intelligent aliens. They were people, with complex thoughts and feelings and relationships that deserved the same respect humanity gave to its own kind. "Captain Chen," Admiral Martinez said quietly, "your documentation was accurate, but it didn't capture the full reality. These are clearly sapient beings with their own culture and social structures." "More than that," Dr. Cray added, "they represent a form of collective intelligence that could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness itself. The potential for mutual learning is incredible." But it was Captain Reed who asked the question that Sarah had been dreading. "Captain, what are your intentions? Will you return with us, or do you plan to remain here permanently?" Sarah looked at the cubs, who had been following the conversation through their connection with her thoughts. Their response came not as words, but as a wave of emotion that told her everything she needed to know about their feelings. They wanted her to stay, but they would understand if she chose to leave. They trusted her to make the decision that was right for all of them. "I'm staying," Sarah said firmly. "These people saved my life, and they've become my family. But more than that, they need protection from well-meaning humans who might not understand what they're dealing with. They need someone who can speak for them in terms our bureaucracy will understand." Admiral Martinez nodded slowly. "The preliminary assessment is clear. This world will be designated as a protected zone under the Sapient Species Protection Act. No exploitation, no unauthorized research, no interference with the indigenous population." "And Captain Chen," Commander Torres asked. "Will serve as official liaison," the Admiral replied, "if she chooses to accept the position." Sarah felt relief wash through her like a wave, not just for herself, but for the cubs who had risked everything to prove their worth to a species they barely understood. "You will stay with us?" Zick's thoughts carried hope and joy in equal measure. "Yes," Sarah replied aloud so that both the cubs and her fellow humans could hear. "I'm staying, we're family now." As the human delegation prepared to return to their ships, Sarah realized that this was just the beginning. There would be more meetings, more documentation, and more challenges as the two species learned to coexist. But for the first time since the disaster that brought her to this world, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. 6 months after first contact, Sarah stood at the edge of the crystalline valley where it all began, watching a sight that would have been impossible to imagine when she first crashed on this world. Human and Kithara children were playing together in the shallows of the expanded stream, their laughter mixing with the musical chimes that the young Kithara made when they were happy. The valley had changed dramatically since the formal establishment of the Joint Research Station. But the changes had been made carefully, with input from both species, designed to enhance rather than replace the natural systems that the Kithara had learned to work with. Sarah's official title was Chief Liaison for Kithara Affairs, but her real job was something more complex and meaningful. She was the bridge between two species learning to understand each other, the translator not just of languages, but of entire worldviews. The cubs, no longer quite cubs but not yet fully adult, had adapted to their new role as ambassadors for their species with the same courage they had shown in everything else. They had learned to communicate with humans who lacked telepathic abilities, developed teaching methods that could convey their healing techniques to human medical personnel, and most importantly, they had begun training the younger Kithara who had been discovered in hidden communities across the continent. Because that was perhaps the most remarkable discovery of all. Zick and his family hadn't been the last of their kind. They had simply been the most isolated, cut off from other survivors by the great catastrophe that had claimed their parents. As word of the human contact spread through Kithara communication networks, other communities had revealed themselves, emerging from deep caves and hidden valleys where they had been struggling to survive. The total population was still small, perhaps 3,000 individuals across the entire continent. But it was enough. The species would survive, and with human medical knowledge complementing their natural healing abilities, they would eventually thrive again. Sarah made her way through the research station, which had been designed as a partnership between human engineering and Kithara environmental integration. The buildings curved with the natural flow of the landscape, their walls incorporating the same crystalline formations that the Kithara used for their homes. Climate control systems worked with rather than against the planet's natural weather patterns, and the power grid drew energy from the same geothermal sources that had sustained Kithara communities for generations. It was a model for how two species could share a world without one dominating the other. In the central building, Sarah found Dr. Cray working with Nira on what had become one of the most important projects in human history: the development of hybrid healing techniques that combined Kithara telepathic abilities with human medical technology. "Any progress on the cancer treatment protocols?" Sarah asked, settling into a chair designed for human proportions but decorated with Kithara artistic sensibilities. "Remarkable progress," Dr. Cray replied, her excitement evident. "Nira's ability to guide cellular repair at the molecular level, combined with our targeted therapy systems, is producing results that were unimaginable just months ago. We're looking at potential cures for conditions that have plagued humanity for centuries. The healing songs of your machines harmonize well. Our life guidance together we can sing away many sorrows." Nira's thoughts came accompanied by complex visualizations of cellular activity that Dr. Cray had learned to interpret with the help of translation software. The young Kithara had grown into one of their species' most skilled healers, but more than that, she had become a true partner in advancing medical knowledge for both species. Sarah smiled as she watched the two work together. This was what she had hoped for when she first made her decision to stay with the Cubs. Not just coexistence, but genuine collaboration that benefited everyone involved. A soft chime from her communication device alerted her to an incoming message from Admiral Martinez, who now served as the military liaison for all human Kithara joint operations. Sarah activated the holographic display and found herself looking at the Admiral's image, transmitted from the orbital station that served as humanity's primary base in this system. Sarah, we've got incoming ships from 3 different species. Word about the Kithara healing abilities is spreading through the galactic community faster than we expected. The Altarians are requesting formal medical consultations. The Centauri Collective wants to establish trade relations, and the Vegan Republic is asking if the Kithara would be willing to help with their plague crisis. Sarah felt a familiar mix of pride and concern. The Kithara had become galactic celebrities, their healing abilities making them the most sought-after medical consultants in known space. But with that fame came dangers that both species were still learning to navigate. "What's the Kithara Council's position?" she asked. "They want to help, of course, but they're also asking for your recommendation on how to proceed without being overwhelmed." Sarah nodded. This was exactly the kind of situation she had been preparing for. The Kithara's generous nature and desire to heal made them vulnerable to exploitation by less scrupulous species. Her job was to help them navigate the galactic political landscape without losing their essential character. "Set up a conference for tomorrow morning," she said. "We'll need representation from both the Kithara Council and the Human Diplomatic Corps, and make sure our legal team is available. We're going to need some very carefully crafted agreements." After the call ended, Sarah made her way to the Kithara gathering space, a natural amphitheater carved into the crystalline cliffs where the community made important decisions. She found the 6 cubs, now officially adults by both human and Kithara standards, waiting for her with the rest of the council. Zik had grown into his role as a leader with the same quiet competence he had shown as a cub. His fur now bore the deep blue markings that indicated his status as a council member, but his thoughts still carried the same protective concern for his family that had made him stand guard over Sarah's pod all those months ago. "The Starwalkers want our help again this brings joy and worry in equal measure." "I know," Sarah replied, settling into her position as the human representative to the council. "Every species we've helped has gone home and told others about what you can do. That's wonderful, but it also means we need to be very careful about how we proceed." The discussion that followed was conducted in the hybrid communication style that had evolved between the two species. Spoken words for complex legal and technical concepts, telepathic thoughts for emotional nuances and shared understanding, and a combination of both for the kind of collaborative decision-making that had become their specialty. The Kithara were unanimous in their desire to help other species, but they were also learning to be realistic about their limitations. They were still a small population, and their healing abilities took tremendous energy. They couldn't save every sick creature in the galaxy, no matter how much they wanted to. But they could do something else. They could teach. "What if we establish a medical academy?" Sarah suggested. "A place where beings from other species could come to learn healing techniques that work with their own physiologies, not trying to duplicate what the Kithara do, but finding ways to apply the same principles to different biological systems." The idea energized the entire council. Teaching was something they could do without depleting their strength, and by spreading knowledge rather than just providing direct treatment, they could help far more beings in the long run. "This honors the old wisdom, teach others to fish rather than giving fish your people have this saying, yes." Pip's thought came with the satisfaction of someone who had learned human idioms and enjoyed using them at appropriate moments. "Yes, exactly," Sarah laughed. "Teach others to fish." As the meeting concluded, and the council members dispersed to their various duties, Sarah found herself walking with Zik through the paths that connected the human and Kithara sections of the research station. The young male had become her closest friend among the Kithara, and their conversations often helped her understand things that formal diplomatic meetings missed. "You are happy with how things have developed?" he asked, his thoughts carrying the careful concern of someone checking on a friend's well-being. "Yes," Sarah said, "but also a little scared. Sometimes I look at everything we've built and worry that it might be too good to last." "Fear of loss is natural when you have found something worth keeping, but we learned long ago that joy postponed for fear is joy lost forever." Sarah felt the truth of that statement settle into her heart. The Cubs had lost everything once, but they hadn't let that loss prevent them from building something new and beautiful. They had taught her not just how to survive grief, but how to transform it into purpose. They had saved her life in ways that went far beyond healing her body. They had shown her how to find family in unexpected places, how to create meaning from loss, and how to build something worthwhile even when starting from nothing. Now, as they worked together to create a future that benefited multiple species, Sarah realized that the Cubs' greatest gift hadn't been their healing abilities or their telepathic communications. It had been their willingness to open their hearts to a stranger who had needed them more than she could have known. As the twin suns began to set over their shared valley, painting the crystalline formations in shades of gold and amber, Sarah felt a deep contentment settle over her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to protect and guide the remarkable species that had become her family. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by the love and trust of beings who had taught her that sometimes the most important rescue missions were the ones where everyone saved each other. In the distance, she could hear the evening song of the Kithara children, their musical thoughts weaving together in harmonies that spoke of hope and possibility. And mixed with those alien melodies were the voices of human children, learning to sing in a language of the heart that transcended species. It was the sound of a future worth fighting for, a symphony of two worlds learning to become one.